and the KGB lags far behind because it incorporates a lot of early pruning cuts that delays precocity. When we look at the when we look at the Gisela 5s, which doesn't include SSA, we see that again TSA is about twice the yields on a per hectare basis as Gisela 6, very similar in the UFO, and we increase the yields in KGB. The smallest, most productive rootstock, of course, gave us the highest yields. So here the highest were the TSA on Gisela 3, 9 times the yield on Gisela 6, roughly 6 times the yield, 5 times the yield on Gisela 5. SSA, very high yields compared to on 6. And the UFO, we bumped them up about 5-fold as well. So that's year 3. Here we move into, that was year 4. Here we move into year 5. In 2014, the Gisela 6s, again the TSA is the most productive, but the UFO is catching up in year 5. For Gisela 5, the UFO, Gisela 5 is actually the highest yielding. And we get up to Gisela 3, and the TSA is the highest yielding, along with the UFO, followed closely by UFO and Gisela 5. And what we can see is, even by year 5 then, the SSA has started to decline for us. This is all with the variety Benton. And if you ever looked at Stephanie Masaki's work with the SSA, he looked at a bunch of different varieties, and there are very strong variety effects with this training system, largely because of that basal flowering population. So we move into last year, year 6, and we can see very similar yields on Gisela 6 between TSA and UFO, TSA being slightly better. On Gisela 5, the same story, TSA being slightly better. You can see the KGB are finally starting to move up in yields. The full canopies are maturing, and once again, the SSA seems to be declining even further. And that holds true even for the Gisela 3. So 2 years prior, we had 9 tons per hectare. We fell to 6, we're down to 5. Here we can see the KGB has come up quite a bit, but the highest yields are still in the TSA and the UFO by year 6 on Gisela 3. The KGB is now in the second tier along with the TSA and the UFO on Gisela 5. So when we put all those yields together and we look at the cumulative yield over these 3 years, the first real fruiting years of the orchard after we were frozen out in year 3, TSA is clearly the most productive on Gisela 6, followed closely by the UFO. Very similar story. The UFO on Gisela 5, UFO on Gisela 5 and the TSA on Gisela 5 are quite similar. And on Gisela 3, we're up to 35 tons per hectare cumulative yield over those 3 years, followed by 30 and then 20 with the SSA. But the real interesting thing is, over these 3 years, all of these systems, KGB, TSA, and UFO, have been increasing each year in their yields, whereas the SSA is declining in its yields. So the last thing I'll just show is, we see now those cumulative yields, and the TSA and the UFO have come to the top thus far through 6 years, TSA being slightly more productive. But last year we looked at the fruit picking rate, how long it took to pick 1 kilogram of fruit. And so when we look at the rootstocks, we see it took the longest to pick the least productive, largest rootstock, Gisela 6, and it was quickest to pick the smaller, more productive Gisela 3 trees, 4.6 minutes per kilogram. When we look at training system, this is where it becomes even more interesting. The most efficient system to pick was the UFO. You could actually pick both sides of the row from one side. You pick one side, you can actually reach around and see the fruit because it's such a narrow system. So it took 4.4 minutes per kilogram to pick. The TSA, which was similar or slightly more productive through 6 years, took 39% longer to pick. So you can see the different systems have different benefits. Some have earlier production, some have longer term production, some are more efficient to pick. So growers have a choice of figuring out where their economic soft point is, or where they're going to make their most money. So that's just a very quick update. I'll be around all week. I've got lots of data that I can share from other systems and some of the other new things that we're doing with this trial. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Greg. Any question for Greg?
This was Benton. Cultivar was Benton. No. No, as I was mentioning, Stefano's paper on the SSA showed that Ferrovia is a perfect variety for SSA training, but there were about 15 other cultivars that he's tried, and none of the other cultivars had the same yields as Ferrovia. I think Regina produced relatively well, Sylvia produced relatively well. There's a whole host of varieties that did very poorly. Benton may be in that same category as the poor ones. The key is where the fruiting populations are. If you have a variety that grows strongly upright and produces a lot of spurs, that's simply going to be a good variety for the training systems that focus on upright growth and a lot of spurs, like the KGB and the UFO. If you have varieties that produce on a lot of lateral shoots, like Cordia, for example, they may perform better in a tall spindle type situation. If you have varieties that produce at the base of lateral shoots, but not too much, then those are probably going to be the best ones for the SSA. So all of these systems, based on where they emphasize the fruiting sites within the canopy, are probably going to be very variety specific.
Okay, do you have some experience in 2 axes or 3 axes? Do you know in Italy or Spain, is in apple and pear is more and more interesting in order to thinking on mechanization? In theory, there are some experience, or what do you think about this possibility?
Yeah, one of the really exciting things that this whole trial has really brought out is working with the KGB and the UFO, we have different numbers of uprights. So you could turn a UFO into a bi-axis tree or a tri-axis tree or a quad-axis or a 6-branch tree. And the interesting thing that we're seeing now that the orchards are mature, and it's one of the slides that I took out because it's so interesting, is how you can modulate the vigor by the number of upright leaders that you develop. So whether you call it a bi-axis or a tri-axis or quad-axis or a UFO with 4 or 5 or 6 uprights, there's a modulation there that gives us a new tool that I don't think we've ever looked at before when we were married to the single leader tree system. So some of the data that we took last year was because the trees are mature, we cut the tops off as you would come through mechanized wise, topping it in the summer. We measured the length of that growth, and then we calculated how much extraneous growth we get. We think that for a good balance of leaf to fruit ratios, we probably want to target annual vigor of about 0.75 meters of new growth on a terminal. Some of the trees had 2 meters of new growth. So clearly that's a system that's too vigorous the way we have trained it. But if it was a UFO or a KGB or a multi-liter tree, we could say if there are 10 uprights that were giving us 2 liters too much, if we added 3 more uprights, we would diffuse that vigor and we would be down to the 0.75 average vigor that we would like. So there's some really interesting ways to modulate vigor even beyond rootstocks as we think about multiple axis trees.
Okay, let's go further. Dr. Schiller?